To the 2021 Minnesota TCD webinar series. I'm glad you've joined us today for Working Towards Zero Deaths Using Big Data and Research. My name is Brian Sorensen. I'm the State Traffic Engineer with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, one of Minnesota's 3 TCD program co-chairs. This morning's session is the 10th of 12 webinars highlighting the latest trends in traffic safety initiatives with expert guests covering a cross-section of traffic safety topics. You can find the list of all topics and speakers, along with a video recording of completed sessions on the TCD website, minnesotatzd.org. There's a ton of great information being shared, and once again this year, it is all free. First, we want to take a moment to thank all the individuals who helped put this webinar series together. A huge thank you to all the session organizers, e-leaders, speakers, moderators, and the countless difference makers behind the scenes that allow us to put these sessions together and bring them to you. I want to express a special thank you to our friends at Do Good Events and the University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies, who have once again this year led the development of this webinar series and had to do so in fairly short order. Thank you for your partnership and for your dedication to Minnesota TCD. I'd also like to recognize that this webinar series is offered by the Minnesota Towards Zero Deaths program and the Minnesota Departments of Health, Public Safety, and Transportation with funding from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. A giant thank you to our loyal and generous sponsors for this year's webinar series, Bolton & Menk, AAA Minnesota Iowa, the Auto Club Group, HDR, Highway Credit Union, and the Minnesota Prevention Alliance. Thank you for supporting traffic safety and the TCD program in Minnesota. Before we start the official webinar topic, the TCD program is excited to recognize the recipient of the 2021 Emerging Medical and Trauma Services TCD Star Award, Tim Cook. Tim was raised in a military family, volunteered at the Hutchinson Fire Department in high school, and also took a mentorship class with the McLeod County Sheriff's Office, so it's not a surprise that Tim chose a career in public service. Tim has been with Sanford Ambulance, formerly the Thief River Falls Area Ambulance, for almost 10 years, has been a part of the Towards Zero Deaths program in the Northwest region since 2016, where he is now the primary representative for Sanford Ambulance. Over the past 5 years, Tim has shown a true passion for traffic safety. He's an integral part of the Pennington County Safe Roads Coalition and is directly involved with the Teen TCD program in Thief River Falls, which I should note was recognized for its outstanding work in our last in-person conference in 2019. Tim is also the first to jump in and represent EMS trauma at any traffic safety event, which includes yearly conferences, mock crash events, and outreach efforts such as the seatbelt campaign the region did earlier this spring. Tim contributes to the conversations around traffic safety in the Northwest region, offers great ideas, and is a strong partner in supporting TCD efforts. Tim, congratulations on your well-earned Star Award. Would you like to say a few words?
Thanks, Brian. It's definitely an honor getting this award. I couldn't do it without the support of my employer. Thanks to my Director of Operations, Mike Schultz, my supervisor, Jamie Jacobson. It's been a great honor getting more involved with TCD this year than we have in the past. Overall, our outreach efforts have expanded in 2021, and it's definitely an honor to bring this home not only to the region, but to Sanford Ambulance as a whole. And it's good to know it's not the first time it came back to Sanford. Christy Engelstead was also an award recipient back, I think it was last year or the year before, but she's at our Sanford Ambulance base in Fargo, actually. So definitely an honor. I appreciate you guys. Appreciate all the work. I thank Linda for helping me get it all lined up and everything. She's been great to work with, and I guess I'll take my time. Thank you.
Well, congratulations again, Tim, and thank you for all that you're doing to improve safety on our roadways through your emergency services work and then through your contributions to TCD as well. Now, on to our topic for today. As many of you know, we are currently evaluating Minnesota's TCD program through an effort we're calling TCD 2.0 to determine if adjustments need to be made to better position ourselves to reduce life-changing crashes in the coming years. Next Monday's session will provide some insight on that process. But as part of TCD 2.0, we've had a lot of discussion about the importance of being data-driven in understanding what's happening on the system and what can be done about it. Being data-driven allows for transparency and accountability by helping both those inside and outside of the program understand how decisions are made. It's also important because through making decisions based on facts and sound research, we have a better chance of implementing changes that most effectively reduce the risk of life-changing crashes. It allows us to prioritize the solutions that have the best chance of making the biggest difference and to assess them after they have been implemented to determine what has truly made a difference and what has not. And lastly, being a data-driven organization will allow for consistency over time. Decisions will be grounded in actual experience and not on the latest whim or fad. Because of all of this, I'm really excited about the presentations we have in store for you today. To help us navigate today's session, I'm pleased to introduce Derek Luer, our state traffic safety engineer at MnDOT, as our moderator. For those that are familiar with Minnesota's TCD program, you know that we rely heavily on Derek and his team as a constant source of traffic safety data to help understand what's happening on our roadway system and to ensure that we are constantly considering and implementing the most effective solutions. Thank you for moderating today, Derek, and I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yep, you sound good.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right. So just once again, for those of you who have joined late, I would like to welcome you again to today's webinar, Working Towards Zero Deaths and Using Big Data and Research. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, but I have a few housekeeping items I have to go through first. Let's make sure it's all right. There we go. All right. So the first part, oh geez. So the first part is question and answers. There's both a chat box and a Q&A on the menu. If you have a question for our speakers, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also ask for technical help through the chat box. We will get to your questions, and at the conclusion of the presentation, if there is a question that needs immediate attention, I can interject at the appropriate time. For those seeking continuing education credits, this TCD webinar series is proud to offer those continuing education credits. These listed credits are available for this webinar. To find the forms, please go to the Working Towards Zero Deaths Using Big Data and Research webpage. All of these forms on today's specific are on the specific webinar page. For those for our law enforcement viewers, post-credit board credits are also available for this webinar. Please read this important announcement from the post board. Whether you are watching this webinar live or recorded, please watch the webinar in its entirety and follow the instructions on the TCD website. The link to this webpage will be put in the chat box. The University of Minnesota will submit your completed affidavit of attendance report to the post board for you. And to get into our speakers today, so I'm going to go through all 4 speakers and then turn it over to them to give their presentation. So please pay attention. So our first speaker today is Shawna Hallmark. Shawna is the director of the Institute for Transportation at Iowa State University. She has over 20 years of experience in conducting traffic safety research. Our next speaker is Neil Hawkins. Neil is the Associate Director of the Institute for Transportation at Iowa State University. He has 32 years of experience in traffic engineering, operations, and safety. Hawkins has worked as a city traffic engineer, a consultant, and for the last 18 years as an academic researcher. His work supports operations research, safety, pavement markings, speed management, and community growth. Our next speaker is Paul Morris. Paul Morris is a principal transportation engineer with SRF Consulting Group, where he manages complex transportation projects. Over the past 15 years, he has assisted clients with a wide variety of traffic and transportation analysis, including travel demand forecasts, highway improvement concepts, and road safety evaluations. In recent years, Morris has overseen many advancements in the use of mapped data sets to reveal additional detail about the performance and operations of our transportation system, from regional travel patterns to detailed crash records. He is a registered professional engineer in Minnesota. He earned a Master's of Science in Transportation Engineering from the University of Minnesota after receiving a BA in Physics in Norwegian from St. Olaf College. I wish I could say congrats in Norwegian, but I did not look far enough into that to know how to do that. Our last speaker today is Gordon Parikh. Gordon is a senior engineer and full stack software developer, SRF Consulting Group. He has over 8 years of experience performing engineering and research services for advanced traffic and transportation applications using big data and other new technologies. Parikh enjoys bringing his broad range of technical knowledge and skills from multiple disciplines to projects and applying his depth of experience to new and complex problems. And with those 4 speakers, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, which I believe is Neil Hawkins. But Neil, please take it away.
All right.
And go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Derek. Appreciate it. And really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all today and talk about this project we did for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Of course, you'll hear from myself and Shawna Hallmark, but we also had some other colleagues working on this project, Skylar Knickerbocker and Teresa Littoral. I want to make sure, if you would, just let me know that the slides look okay.
Yep, you look good.
All right, we'll take it from there. So as all of us have experienced COVID-19, the pandemic, the stay-at-home orders have greatly impacted traffic volumes, specifically starting in March of 2020, and in some places lingering on till today. And back in March, April, May timeframe, there were some patterns starting to emerge that was a big concern to law enforcement as well as agencies. And that was yes, volumes were down, but there seemed to be some excessive speed going on, and there was some pretty severe crashes being seen. You know, overall, we thought the crash for that year would be down, and it was, but we started seeing the severities and the fatals and major injuries going up. Iowa DOT, some observations. Iowa DOT saw a 65% increase in drivers going more than 25 miles per hour over the posted speed limit. Ohio issued 61% more citations for folks going over 100 miles per hour. California had 15,000 tickets for folks going over 100 miles an hour. And in Virginia, they saw a 78% increase in speed-related fatal crash, even though their overall crash was down by 45%. So these were alarming. The picture on the top right shows the Iowa State Patrol pulling someone over at 124 miles per hour. And there was just a casual attitude. I think combination of less traffic out there and people maybe even thinking there's less enforcement going on given the staffing shortages and the unknowns about the virus and where we're all headed next. So this report looks at the change in volume and speeds from March of 20 through that rest of that year of 20 and compares it with 2019 and in some cases 2018. So the data we had available and the concept for this study was to pick 10 corridors and kind of compare what we could for data. Fortunately, we were able to grab all of the state's ATR locations and traffic sensor locations and use as many of those as possible to do our comparison and to provide some data analysis. As Brian was noting, you know, using big data to make our decisions is really the goal, and so that's what this project was focused on. One of the issues faced is, of course, data quality and looking at how well the data collected can be used for comparison purposes. The graph over here on the right just gives you an idea of 2018 volumes in red, 2019 volumes in blue. You can see these similar patterns starting in January, and then volumes go up much higher by August and then start tapering down again towards December. You see that pattern repeated for 2019. And then in orange over here is 2020. And you see those volumes were, as usual, January, February, March started to climb, but by early mid-March, they dropped significantly. And that's that volume impact and never really quite recovered compared to the previous 2 years. So what we had to do was look at the data quality for all of the sites and make sure they were comparable. we wanted to compare, for example, the volumes at 11 a.m. on March 1st for a specific site. And we wanted to make sure that that same volume and speed data was included for that same day, March 1st at 11 a.m. for 2019 and for 2020. And so we essentially set a threshold that we wanted any site we used, we wanted at least 90% completeness for the data. And so we ended up being able to use 27 out of the 92 ATR sites and 68 out of the 98 sensor sites. The traffic sensor sites are the Wavetronics types of sensors that you see along the roadway. The ATR sites are more of a shotgun approach across the state. That doesn't mean that all of those ATR sites were producing bad data. It's just for a high level comparison that we were trying to do. We were trying to really zero in on speed and volume influence and compare as many data points as possible. So this is an example of a couple of, a handful of sites where you see blue horizontal line, that's where data is being received and available. And where you see gaps of white, that's where it's not. As we filter that data, you see that we get it much better by selecting those sites we could compare against each other. So the analysis included developing and calculating a lot of statistics and developing visualizations and a tool for Minnesota DOT to be able to look at any site or all sites together. So we looked at raw volumes, we looked at volume over time, the average speeds, average speed over time. And then for the ATR sites, because of the way the data were binned, we could look at much more. We could start analyzing the high speed volume. So how many vehicles are traveling at a high speed, which was 15 miles per hour over the posted, and what is the percent of vehicles traveling at that high speed? We could look at the distribution of average speeds by year, as well as the high speeds by month, day of week, hour, and the 85th percentile speeds. This is just an example showing that for a number of sites here on the left, looking first at volume, comparing 2020 to 2019, the values in red, the volumes were almost all down except for 2 sites. The maximum percent reduction is 57% for one of the sites. That happened in July. Most of the other sites were April, where they saw the maximum drop in percent volume. In terms of average speeds, we had the posted speeds. We knew the average speed change from 2019 to 2020. In every case, the average speed was higher. And then the maximum increase in that average speed from 2020 to 2019, it was up to 6.6 miles per hour for one site. All the rest were somewhere in the 0 to 3.5. So with average speeds, those are really hard to move that needle. That's an average. And so we're really excited to be able to start focusing on high speed. As I mentioned, we defined high speed as greater than 15 over the posted speed. We could then calculate the number of vehicles traveling at high speed. We could look at the difference in the number of vehicles traveling at high speed in 2020 versus 2019, and in most cases, they were all higher. We could look at the percent of vehicles at high speed. In one case, almost 10% of the vehicles on the road were traveling 15 or more miles over the posted speed limit. And then we could look at the difference in that percent of vehicles traveling at high speed in 2020 as it compared to 2019. And these colors don't indicate, a red doesn't indicate a negative. This is just a high versus lower thematic coloring. So one site had 3.5% more people traveling at high speeds in 2020 versus 2019. So as I mentioned, we were able to take sites across the state for ATR sites. So that gives us a nice comparison across the state. We were also able to identify specific locations within the metro area using the sensor sites. We developed a tool using Tableau, which allowed you to grab one site, you could grab multiple sites, you could grab every site and look at the statistics combined. The analysis included some visualizations. For example, here is looking at the volume, and for this is for all of the ATR sites together, with this top graph showing that in April, the volumes in 2020 were the lowest. So the red is 2018, blue is 2019. So you can see this big drop, and then it goes back up. But it never quite gets to the 2018 and 2019 volume levels. We then can look at the percent change in volume and then the distribution in these box and whisker plots, and each dot here is a month. You can see the volumes are down from 2018 to 2019. and over here's the average speeds, and the average speeds are up during that same time frame. We did a similar analysis and tool for the sensor sites, as you see here, with again the volumes much lower in 2020, but the speeds being much higher. We could look at the percent of speed. So for example, horizontally, you've got 70 to 75, 75 to 80. As we read from left to right, the speed bends go higher. So 16% of the vehicles were at high speed in 2020 versus only 13% in 2019. We then looked at these high speeds by month, by day of week, and by time of day. We ended up putting together a top 5 sensor sites and top 5 ATR sites, which had the highest amount of change, and that change being more speeding. So we put those together in a list for MnDOT as sort of that first group you could start looking at. In this case, I'm showing here, you can see it's a pretty rural cross section. 9.7% of all the vehicles were at 15 miles over the posted speed limit. The one below is again a rural site. 8.6% were above that. We're speeding at we're traveling at high speeds. And then here's a more urban location where again 11% of the traffic was at high speed or 15 miles per hour over the posted. Just to summarize, at 85% of the ATR sites, the volumes were lower. The average speeds were higher at 92%. The number of vehicles were 69% higher that were traveling at high speed, and the percent of vehicles was 88% more traveling at that 15% or over. In terms of the sensor sites, we were able to show, of course, the volumes were lower, the average speeds are higher. We did look at a couple of work zones, but as we compared the 2019 and 2020 volumes using sensor data, you can see that due to the lane closures and construction across those sites in 2019, it was impossible to compare those data with data in 2020 just because of the lane closures and construction activity disruptions. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Shawna Hallmark, who will start off with an audience poll. Shawna?
Thank you, Neil. So we have a couple poll questions that are coming up right now. I'll let you go ahead and take a minute for those. The first question, we were wondering what you have seen in your agency as far as speeds going up. And so that's what this question is for. All right, so it looks like most of you are saying that speeds increased during COVID and they seem to have stayed up. And I think that's been a pretty common experience. And then it looks like a few said speeds are higher than pre-COVID, but not as high as during COVID. And then it looks like a couple responded that they've returned to normal. So I think your experience is pretty much the same as others have seen. We have another poll. You could bring that up. So this question is just asking what you may have done to address speed increases either during COVID or more recently, and how you've kind of tackled that. Okay, so it looks like about a third of you haven't done anything specific to address those speed increases during COVID, and some have increased enforcement and some have implemented countermeasures. And this was unfortunately a single choice. Some of you probably did both enforcement and other countermeasures. So interesting to see that how people are addressing that. So thank you. Neil talked first about the COVID impact on speeds in Minnesota. And another part of the project that we did was looking at crash rates and then how enforcement had changed during COVID. So we worked with Minnesota DOT, and we were able to get 6 Minnesota State Patrol districts to respond, and they gave us some great information. We also did kind of a quick poll of them and asked them what their general perceptions are. So during COVID, we asked, did you notice an increase in speeding in general? And all of them said that they had noticed an increase. Another question was whether they had noticed excessive speeding, which in a lot of cases would be greater than 15 miles an hour over this posted speed limit. And 83% that they had mentioned they had noticed that during COVID. And bear in mind, I think we asked these questions back early spring, maybe January, February. So it's been a little bit of time since then. And then we asked if they had noticed any other problem behaviors, which could be distracted driving, aggressive driving. And about 2/3 indicated that they had seen other problem behaviors on the roadway. And then specific to work zones, we asked about whether they thought speeds had gone up in work zones or and whether they'd stayed the same. And I think about half answered that they had gone up and about half answered that they had stayed the same. Next slide. The 6 districts also provided us with information about crash data for the 5 years previous to 2020 and then for 2020. So we aggregated data a couple different ways. We did 2019 and the previous 5 years, and then we compared in some cases just 2019 and 2020. So what this these graphs are showing for each of the districts that responded, we plotted out the number of crashes, which would be the bar, and then and then we also plotted out the, that was the exact opposite. So the bar in line is showing crashes and then enforcement. So as you can see, most districts did not experience an increase in crashes. And in a lot of cases, they also had a decrease in enforcement. And that was due to the fact that a lot of, during the early days of the pandemic, I think there was not uncertainty as to how they were going to address it. And then later, obviously, as you know, in Minnesota, there was a few other things taking up officers' attentions. So there was no clear pattern about crashes and level of enforcement. We dug a little bit deeper in the data, and we looked at the percentage of speeding related crashes before COVID and then during COVID. And this is where a really interesting pattern emerged. And so what these 2 charts are showing, the top chart is total crashes, so all crashes. The bottom chart is just fatal and injury crashes. So for each district, we have shown the 5-year average from 2015 to 2019 as a comparison. And then just 2019 was the year previous to COVID. And then finally, the last row would be the total crashes that were speeding related in 2020. So if you look at just the first district, 2100, the 5-year average was about 16% of crashes were speeding related. And just before COVID, about 18% of crashes were speeding related. And then during COVID, officers were coding 20% of crashes as being speeding related. So it was 2 to 4% higher than previous years, depending on which year you're comparing it to. So the most significant difference was in Patrol District 2300. They had a 19% of crashes being speeding related before the 5 years before, and 22% during 2019. During COVID, that jumped up to 26% of crashes were speeding related. So as you can see, there was a greater percentage of crashes happening that were speeding related. There was, of course, fewer crashes overall, but the ones that were happening were more likely to be speeding related. The bottom chart is showing just fatal and injury crashes. So the same thing for District 2300, which is the middle, is from the 5-year average from 2015 to 2019 is about 20% of fatal and injury crashes were speeding related. For 2019, it was about the same at 21%. Then in 2020, that number jumped up to 34%, which is about 14% more than the previous years. So, and then if you look at the other cells, you can see that overall there was a general trend towards the number of crashes that were speeding related, either total crashes or fatal injury crashes had definitely increased. Next slide. So we, just to summarize, about 2 to 5% increase in total crashes are speeding related, and then about 4 to 14% of crashes, sorry, that should be 14%, not 11. And so in general, all of the districts experienced 5 out of 6 had an increase in total crashes being speeding related, and 4 out of 6 had an increase in fatal and injury crashes being speeding related. Next slide. So at the end of the work that we did, we developed a report, and it basically talks about the introduction, data collection, data analysis. There was a few really cool big data tools that Neil talked about a little bit previously. Those are expanded on in the report if you have any interest in either clicking on and using those tools or just seeing what we did. And then finally, we'd like to acknowledge everybody who helped us with this project. So of course, MnDOT for funding, our technical advisory panel, which was Derek Lair, Brent Rusco, and Vic Lund. And then we'd like to thank the Minnesota State Patrol for providing crash enforcement data. And then we'd like to thank MnDOT for providing the ATR and sensor data. So now we'd like to turn it back over to Derek.
All right, thank you so much, Shawna and Neil. Really good presentation. It was a fascinating research paper to be a part of, and I'm really glad we got to look into this more in depth and capture it for posterity too. But our next speakers now are Paul and Gordon, and I will turn it over to them to go over their part of the presentation. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Derek. And is our presentation showing on the screen now?
Yes, it is looking good.
All right, well, thank you very much. Appreciate the introductions here, Derek. We're very excited to share with this group today, as well as I want to extend congratulations to Mr. Cook on being recognized for the award, and to Neil and Shawna for the excellent presentation. So we're excited to present today about Towards Zero Deaths with Big Data. We really see tremendous opportunity for the future when it comes to new and emerging data sources here. And so we hope that our remarks here today will be instructive in terms of starting to kind of set the stage for what you might expect to see or what some of those opportunities are in the year to come. So I know big data can be sort of a amorphous term. It's something we hear in the news about Google or Microsoft or something. So let's maybe just start with the definition here about kind of how we see big data, particularly in sort of the transportation realm, especially for those of us outside of Silicon Valley. So one characteristic I would add here is that it requires combining data sources from multiple sources. So you're not just looking at one data set, say crashes or roadway characteristics, but really trying to piece together a number of disparate elements here. The quantity of data, while it is big, it doesn't have to be, sort of Google or Amazon big, but it will probably exceed traditional tools. And when I talk about traditional tools, I'm really referring to something like a Microsoft Excel, where you now are going to want to graduate into more of a robust data environment. The benefit of that is that we expect it to expose trends not revealed in samples or averages. One of the things we say in the sort of big data world is the last thing you want to do is average your data, which of course is always a big temptation to try to simplify that large data set down to something more manageable, but you don't want to do that. That diversity and separation of the data is in fact the very thing that makes it valuable. And along with that, this idea of finding the signal through the noise. And so when you have big data, a lot of the data points individually aren't going to make a lot of sense. And so we're looking for some of those big picture trends pointing towards some specific outcomes. And so translating this into the transportation realm, what we really are interested in when it comes to big data is connected devices. And so this is information where the vehicles or devices within the vehicles are telling us things about the travel that's happening on our roadways. There's a number of devices that can provide that kind of data. So navigation, those that have, say, like a GPS, navigation unit installed in their dash. Fleet, a lot of trucks and other organizationally owned vehicles are equipped with tracking equipment and perhaps other sensors on those vehicles. And increasingly, we're seeing mobile devices, so your cell phones or other sort of handheld GPS units that are also providing that data on the go. And we're also seeing more integration of what we call location-based services. So this is when you have Wi-Fi on your phone or other mobile device. That device is sort of checking in each time you go to a point of interest. So for example, a coffee shop, restaurant, store that has Wi-Fi, there are ways that that information is tracked sort of at the aggregate level. So one thing I really want to emphasize here is that when we talk about data, particular, data that describes human movement, it's only going to grow. I think we all recognize that we've sort of passed the point of no return, that it's going to be more, it's not going away. And when we start to talk about connected vehicles, that really will unleash torrents of data. And so if we think it's big now, just wait a couple of years, because I think it's going to really explode. So let's now bring in the safety side a little bit. When we think about traditional safety analysis, there's a pretty established approach to how traffic safety analysis is done from an engineering perspective. That begins with gathering a 5-year crash history. And of course, we're very fortunate that the Department of Public Safety does such a good job of archiving those crash records. And then at a location level, we're going to normalize that by the traffic volume, recognizing that there's an exposure component there. And so places with more traffic would expect to see more crashes. And so we want to normalize that. And then we're going to ask for, compared to typical locations throughout the region or the state, is that crash rate above or below an average rate for a similar type of facility? And if it's above, then we would also ask, is it above the critical rate? And really that's a way of probing the statistical significance of, is it marginally above that average rate, or is it really a significant issue? And so that's a very well-established approach to that. The problem is that it's reactive. And so as those of us that are analysts that perform these types of crash analysis, we essentially have to wait for those crashes to occur before there's something to measure. And when we think about, these locations that are ultimately going to become sort of our priority or focus locations, they're probably not going to have, more than perhaps one fatal crash or just a small number of serious injury crashes in that 5-year window. And we hate to see that happen. We want to prevent those before they occur. I mean, I think that's a view that we would all share, that rather than being reactive, we'd like to be proactive. So knitting this together then with the big data and connected vehicles, we really see an opportunity here. So a lot of new data sources are coming online as a part of the technological developments, both in our vehicles and other devices that we take with us when we travel. And this provides a lot of detailed in-vehicle data. And we think there's opportunities where that can tell us about locations with increased crash risks. And we're going to explore the question a little more specifically. Can these provide a proxy for crash risks and help improve safety? So you're probably asking now sort of, well, what is connected vehicle data? Is that something that exists? Is that the future? And so one thing I think could help is relating this back to the level of automation. Obviously, we're hearing a lot about CAVs these days. And so 6 levels ranging from 0 to 5 have been established to describe the different levels of vehicle automation here. What we see right now is that levels 0, 1, and 2 are very common among the vehicles available today. Obviously, traditional vehicles are 0, where you as the human are really just operating that machine with no assistance. However, levels 1 and 2 are increasingly common, and really, I would say, becoming pretty commonplace technologies. Things like blind spot warnings, adaptive cruise control, braking assist features. Those are really the early stages of autonomous driving here. However, as those systems become more autonomous and more self-governing, that's when we start to get into levels 3 through 5. So how does this relate to connected vehicles? Are connected vehicles really just going to come online once we get to those higher levels of automation? The reality is no. Connectivity can really be present at any level of automation. And so as you think back about some of the systems that I mentioned earlier, the in-dash navigation system, there's many vehicles produced in recent years that don't have any of those automated features, but do have that connectivity. Similarly, systems like OnStar in GM vehicles is really a connected vehicle system that's been around for almost a couple decades at this point. And so what we're seeing in the industry is really a proliferation of different organizations that are really working in that connected vehicle space. And so on the left, this is just a sample of a lot of the startups, and they really exist in sort of that venture capital, Silicon Valley type space here. And they're ingesting a lot of that connected vehicle data from all these different devices and vehicles. But what's important is really what do they turn that data into? And so as you look at sort of the right side of the screen, the question we want to ask is, what do we want to know about those vehicles? Is it their location? Is it the speed they're traveling on the roadways? Is it the travel patterns and where they're going? Or is it how the vehicle is actually operating or being operated? So one example that we want to focus on a little bit today is Wejoe. This is one of the providers of this data. And they were kind enough to share a sample data set with us to do some of this early experimental analysis here. They offer data in 2 categories. One of them is called driving events, and the other is vehicle movements here. And so those are distinct data set. Driving events really understand when key activities occur as the vehicle is underway. And so we'll show a few more details of that along the way. Vehicle movements, meanwhile, is really more holistic description of the journey that travelers are making. And so in terms of where that vehicle started, how it navigated along the roadway network to get where it's going, and ultimately where it ended up. And so just examples from these 2 different kind of categories of data, you can see some of the movement data provides information about location, speed, the time that occurred, and the heading of the vehicle. Meanwhile, that event data, again, tells us a little bit more about what the vehicle was doing or the driver was doing during that journey. So things like, were the seatbelts buckled at the time? When was the car turned on or turned off? And finally, harsh braking and acceleration are also some of the components available in that driver event data set. So just some other characteristics of this connected vehicle data. Those vehicles are providing a ping of information back to the central repository here approximately every 3 seconds. And so you can imagine as you're going along the road, that's a pretty detailed account of where that is and how that vehicle is moving. And multiplied across a lot of vehicles, that's a tremendous amount of data. So, as of over the past year or so, over 1 billion per month across the United States. Accuracy is very high, down to about 3 meters. And so that really kind of gets you to a level where you can observe individual parking areas or lanes on a highway. And really the beauty of this is being able to aggregate that data into specific features out in the world and on the roadway network. So this is just a little bit deeper dive into some of those specific data elements that are included in the data sets here. I'm not going to go into any of those individual ones, but as Linda noted, the presentation will be posted on the website here, and certainly encourage you to look back if you're interested in more detail on that. So a couple of ways that this data is available here is really telematics is the kind of the buzzword that's used, and that's the idea of measuring something that's far away or that's moving out in the environment, but then bringing those measurements back into kind of a centralized location here. And so again, some of those things that we saw, location and speed, as well as those more isolated events such as speeds that exceeded a certain threshold, seatbelt usage, braking and acceleration. And so Wejoe is gathering this data through vehicle manufacturers. And so that's going directly through there. And I would just emphasize that this data is anonymized and scrubbed of any personal information. So the intent is really not to provide any personally identifiable information or to track individual journeys here. But as I mentioned kind of in the opening about the big data, we're really trying to look at this kind of in a holistic way and see the signal through the noise. So it's just an example, just in terms of the density of data on a given highway over time, and how really it's a very accurate representation of how those trips are moving along the highway network. You can see them, using the on-ramps and off-ramps, and even different lanes on the highway facilities. So as we began to become more familiar with this type of data, that's when, as researchers, your mind really starts racing, and we're interested in the possibilities here. So some of the questions that really came up fairly quickly is, can vehicle operation events predict crashes? And even more broadly, can this vehicle performance data be used across the ease of traffic safety? And in what other ways would connected vehicle data be beneficial to safety studies? We think there's even more opportunities across the transportation industry, but we really see safety as one of the really foremost opportunities here. So with that as a little introduction to some of the traditional engineering approaches, big data, and specifically connected vehicle data, I'd invite Linda to bring up the poll question here. And with that kind of background in mind, we're interested to hear, what experiences have you had with connected vehicle data in your work? And so the choices are, I use it myself. If you're a practitioner and you've actually pulled up different types of data sources, keeping in mind that this doesn't have to be sort of big data, but even things like Google or Waze, some of the apps that you might use to understand what's going on with traffic or other conditions on the roadways. Another option is, others in my organization use it. I'm aware it's used in my industry, but my organization doesn't use it, or none that I'm aware of. We'll give you a few minutes to make your selections here, and then we'll take a look at the poll results. Wow, okay, so a pretty even split here. This is very encouraging. I was nervous that not too many would have used it themselves, or others in our organization would use it, but we're seeing a fairly even split, perhaps with the caveat that about a third aren't aware of it being used in your industry. So I think that's something to keep your eyes open for. Do you start to see it being used, or are there opportunities where you could perhaps explore or recommend using that in some future applications here? So with that in mind, I'm excited to turn it over to my colleague, Gordon Parikh here, and he's going to dig into a little bit of the harder research in terms of what we found with investigating this data. Go ahead, Gordon.
Thanks, Paul. So as Paul noted, our main question was whether this data could be used to predict crashes. So in this case, we specifically focused on those harsh braking events that Paul talked about, but potentially other attributes could be useful for this as well. But so we asked, are high incidences of these harsh braking events an indicator of locations with increased crash risks? So next slide. So given this hypothesis, we gathered some sample data to try and confirm or disprove it. Our study period covered about 2 weeks in the fall of 2019, comprising about 8 million trips. We covered the Twin Cities metro area down along the Highway 52 corridor down to Rochester. And we chose this area because it contains a mix of urban and rural areas, including the Twin Cities, of course, and then smaller urban area in Rochester. And because of the Highway 52 corridor itself, which MnDOT has designated as a CAV test corridor. And so it's a corridor of interest these days. But and then given the resolution of this data, even the small amount was pretty substantial, speaking to the big data point that Paul was talking about. But we were able to leverage some cloud processing to help facilitate the analysis. Next slide. So in this data set, we had over 1 million harsh braking events over those 2 weeks and about 1,500 crash records covering all different crash types. And this map here shows a look at some of the harsh braking events occurring in the Twin Cities metro area over a portion of the day, so aggregated there. And then to join the data sets, we aggregated the data by location, then used those locations to match up the 2 data sets. Next slide. For our analysis, first we ran a cluster analysis to detect subgroups within the data. Then we ran a statistical analysis to determine the predictive power of those harsh brake events. So this gave us a numerical relationship between harsh brake events and crashes that could then be used to estimate the number of crashes that would be expected given a certain number of those braking events. Next slide. So looking at our results, we found that there was a correlation between harsh braking events and crashes with high statistical significance. So that is based on this data. A location with significant numbers of harsh braking events is significantly more likely to have crashes than other locations. And we also found that given the relationship produced by the regression, a high occurrence of these events was predictive of crashes with an acceptable false positive rate of about 26%. Now, of course, this is quite generalized, so I'm looking at a pretty broad level. So further research, we're exploring separating urban and rural areas, looking at functional classes or specific crash types, geometric features, and other attributes that might make for a stronger relationship. But the takeaway is that the basic relationship holds, and so this further investigation holds some promise for the future. Next slide. So the outcome of this is a model for taking harsh braking events, our independent variable, to predict crashes, our dependent variable. And generally this shows the expected relationship. So more harsh braking events translates to more crashes. And you can see in the graph here, which shows the model we produced along with the 25th and 75th percentile of observed crashes at different levels of harsh braking, that the model is generally within the range of the data we observed. Next slide.
Gordon?
Yep.
Hey, we had a timely question that I figured would be worth asking, but how is a harsh braking event defined?
That is a good question. I don't know the exact number, but I believe it's when the acceleration rate, the braking acceleration rate, so the deceleration rate crosses a critical threshold, so a certain number of feet squared per second or something like that. So I'm not sure of the exact number, but they have some threshold that they define as kind of that hard jerk that you might experience with a harsh braking event. So that's a good question though.
All right, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh yeah, no, that was good to bring up then. Thanks. So one other thing we did to help investigate this data was build a dashboard for data visualization. So in this case, we have a map interface that allows exploring locations with a high coincidence of harsh braking events and crashes. So you can see in the video there, the user can filter to locations with the high numbers of harsh braking events and crashes and see how it affects the resulting data set and explore those locations. And this kind of tool can just be useful to explore data, help generate more ideas for analysis, potential contributing factors, and other trends like that. So it helps with this kind of exploratory analysis. Next slide. But so the takeaway from all this is that the connected vehicle data that's starting to become available now shows a lot of promise for safety analyses. Of course, this is fairly generalized and could benefit from some further refinement. So like I mentioned before, we have some ideas for things to explore that might make for a stronger relationship, like crash type, contributing factors, facility types, speeds, near misses. And then we're also interested in improving the accuracy of our spatial methodology to improve the performance of the model. But with that, I'll pass it back to Paul and to speak about some of the general considerations of this research. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Gordon. So just a couple of things now that we've had an introduction to big data and applications to transportation and safety specifically here. Just some things to keep in mind, as conversations continue to build around use of big data and whether it's the degree to which it's appropriate or beneficial for our work here. And so when we're talking about these large volumes of diverse types of data sets, as I noted early on, this does lead to the need for a new generation of tools. It's not to say that these tools are brand new or we're not familiar with them, but I think our industry has not traditionally made use of these tools. So that is going to trigger a need for more professionals that are familiar with programming, statistics, data analysis, and modeling. And so I think you'll see, more and more that our colleagues are becoming those types of professionals here. I do want to emphasize again, the goal is really finding the signal through the noise. And so we're looking for those big trends that we may not traditionally have seen through our historical methods of looking at crash data and performing those types of safety studies here. What we're seeing in the data right now is that a lot of issues occur where we expect them to. These are locations that either have, known crash issues, perhaps higher levels of congestion or busier traffic that again would predict higher levels of crashes. But I do want to caution the group or just put a flag out there that says we need to keep an eye out for issues where we don't expect them, because that would really be, I think, the trigger that would demonstrate some value for this is if it's telling us something we don't already know. The question we then have to ask ourselves is, what do we do when that happens? Are we ready to commit to some of these findings and make investments or other changes to our system and our practices to respond to those issues? And what kind of institutional change or education among all of our different partners in the TCD industry here to be able to implement those changes to help improve safety? So just in closing, we have a long list here of just some general things that we've brainstormed here. Again, a lot more research needed, as Gordon mentioned, of how this data could potentially be used in transportation and safety specifically here. But we're also interested in your input. So we're going to close with one more participant question here. In this case, we want to have it more of an open-ended response. And so we're not going to use the polling feature that Linda had pulled up earlier here. I'd like you to just use your chat function. And we'd like to hear from the audience here. How do you think connected vehicle data has the potential to help traffic safety? So go ahead and write in your chat just a really simple response. It doesn't need to be a complete sentence or complete thought, but just a couple words on some applications that you think might be beneficial or at least worth further investigation here. All right, starting to see a couple come through here, so that's great. Spots on the road that need improvement, allow for more research opportunities, warning police, queue warning systems. I think that's a great one. And I think John is onto something there, because while the data we investigated and explored today was more historical, this type of data is expected to be available more in a real-time environment. And that could be used for some of those queue warning systems. All right, they're really pouring in now. I'm having a hard time keeping up with them here. Accident reconstruction, I think that's a great one. And I think as the sample size of connected vehicles on the roadway increases right now, our understanding is that it's hovering somewhere around 10% of new vehicles on the road that have that kind of connectivity. But, you know, we definitely expect that as more vehicles, you know, roll off the assembly lines and onto dealership lots, that increasing percentage of those will have that. And so I think that's a good idea. Partnerships and outreach where data suggests harsh braking and other problems. That's great. You know, I think, you know, trying to look at some of the other E's beyond just engineering. So education, you know, is a key feature there. GPS to identify hazards on the road, origin destinations of vehicle trips, and feedback warning when speed is excessive. So that's a great one. And I'm seeing that warning drivers that their speed is excessive. So that would actually be sort of a vehicle feature, providing that information back to drivers. You know, another way that could happen would be notifying law enforcement or other agencies here. Well, great. Well, this is terrific. I'm going to make sure Linda or Susan here, if you can grab some of the comments that have been made in the chat. I think there's a lot of good ideas here and might be something we'd want to share back with the group, or at least record in our summary of today's discussion here. So thank you all so much. And by all means, if there's others that you come to mind, don't be afraid to reach out, submit those to the TCD committee, you know, or share those within your own organization here. So that really concludes what we had prepared today. Thank you so much for your the opportunity to speak today and the great participation in the polls and the chat questions here. We appreciate it and certainly welcome any questions.
All right. Thank you, Paul and Gordon and Neil and Shawna for those great presentations. Before we get to questions, we'd like it if everyone can take a minute to fill out an evaluation survey. That's you start your video. Oh, is it up on screen now? All right, thank you. So a link to the evaluation can be found in the chat box here, and also with this QR code. So if you have your phone, you can go ahead and click this and you should be able to open the survey. The TCD leadership does read the results from these surveys and uses this information for future events. So thank you for filling this out. So I'll pause for a couple minutes and let people either get that information or go ahead and take the survey. One more time, just show it there and then we'll hop into Q&A. Hop into the Q&A. Oh. So we have a few questions in the chat pod here, and I'll just read through them one by one and we'll see who can best answer them. But so the first one here is speed limits on Minnesota 100 and Minnesota 62 have recently been raised at 55 to 60 miles per hour. Has the data on increased speeds been used to accept traffic calming? Have speeds increased after higher speed limits? I'm not sure if there's any of our panelists are readily available to answer that. Does anybody have? I can take a crack at it, but I'll take a swing at it. So yes, Minnesota 100 and 62 were recently raised, I believe last fall, if I recall correctly, or last spring. I have not seen any specific after data on that, on those roadways, but I will say historically, every time we have raised speed limits on roadways, typically we don't see any major changes in how people use that roadway. Typically our speeds stay about the same. Typically, if we see anything, it might be that 50th percentile of drivers might bump up by a mile or 2 per hour. But really, overall, just changing that number on posted speed limits typically has very little impact on how people use that roadway. Paul or Neil or Gordon, any insight to add to that?
I just think from a speed management perspective, there's a lot more to it than just the sign. There's the context. And so some of the advanced tools that Federal Highway is pushing to establish speed limits takes into context the roadway, the driveways, the terrain, and other important things that seem to dictate and how we as drivers select a speed. And so, like you said, oftentimes for traffic calming purposes, we're lowering the speed limit. And as you noted, people don't often respond very well without reinforcement, which is difficult to provide on a continuous basis. So it's very frustrating to see. And so it's good that how we establish our speed limits is being challenged, and new ways to consider context and those influences of context on our selection is very important.
Yeah, thanks for that, Neil. All right, the next question we had, and I'm going to guess this is for Paul or Gordon. Do any systems capture abrupt/irregular steering movements?
Yeah, I think that's a good question here. The particular data set that we had the opportunity to look at didn't have that particular feature, but our understanding that is one of the things that vehicle manufacturers are putting into the vehicles now. And so with this being an emerging field or type of data, those providers like a Wejoe have actually sort of encouraged us to provide feedback for other things that we'd like to see. And that's definitely one of the things on the top of the list that we have recommended back to those providers that would be really useful. So yeah, good question. And hopefully it's something we'll see in the future.
And I would just add that there are people, our phones do pitch, yaw, and roll too. And most of us have a phone in our pocket or with us in the car. And so there's lots of people looking at just harvesting phone data to get that and provide feedback to drivers. Of course, the insurance companies are using it. There's team driver initiatives where they're putting it, insurance companies work with parents to put it in team driver vehicles for coaching and other things. So it's definitely something we can measure, and definitely the vehicle manufacturers are measuring it as well. I think they're deciding what revenue streams they can turn out of the vehicles, out of the data that they're already capturing and using in more modern vehicles that they're selling now.
Good answers. Thank you, all of you. Kind of on a related note, and the next question was, has anyone tracked the activation of electronic stability control in connected vehicles? That would have huge value in road maintenance, predictability, and police response, especially during winter weather. Part question, part statement, I guess. But
yeah, I can just add, I know there's a company that has presented to a road weather information systems group called Aurora. They're overseas right now, but they're basically working with manufacturers, with the OEMs themselves. So they basically have algorithms where they're getting data from the axles of the vehicles, and they're able to predict grip or friction based on the performance of the vehicle. And then they turn around and sell that to agencies during snow events or after a big storm, how much of the normal friction is back, and where they need to go do more work. So there are people not using after data. They're literally in the vehicle with their algorithm producing this data, and then they get what they want out of the manufacturer's data stream to do it. So definitely in the area of friction and grip. It's my understanding they're working with one manufacturer right now, but of course they could overnight open that up to a lot more in somewhere like the US. Hope that helps.
yeah, no, good answer. All right, I think we got time for about one more question, maybe two, but this one's probably good and kind of philosophical, so we'll probably all have to think about the answer for a moment. But how does the insurance industry fit into this puzzle? Can this type of data help create insurance incentives for drivers who show safe behavior through the data? And I think all of us have probably received that little chip in the mail from our insurance company where they want you to plug it into your car, right? And then you drive around for a few weeks and mail it back and they give you a discount no matter what. But if you're a better driver, they give you a bigger discount. I always thought those were really interesting. I think people get those and they think, I'm going to drive really safe for the next few weeks and show them what a great driver I am. But invariably, after 2 or 3 weeks, we forget about that when we revert back to our old habits, right? That's why they make you plug it in for about 6 weeks. So you can kind of go back to your old ways. But yeah, does anybody have any thoughts on that or a good answer? So I'll turn it over to our panelists.
No, I think you hit it, Derek. I think this is really cross-cutting of the industries here. And frankly, probably some of the more big business, that you think of like insurance, probably is out in front, as they have more resources and more sort of financial incentive to be exploring these kind of things. So, if anything, I think we should be taking their lead, in terms of exploring those new markets, really trying to take advantage of the technologies and hopefully finding opportunities to improve our work.
And I would agree with Paul that this is not new to the insurance industry. In fact, a lot of fleet statistics are being done for private companies all across the globe on how well their employees are driving. They'll go as far as to give them an unsafe driver label until you ride with someone and get coached. So, across the oil industry and all kinds of industries have been using these kinds of diagnostics for coaching their own employees on their driving habits and trends. And so it's not new to them.
All right. So I think we got kind of one question. It's kind of more of a statement though, but I'll just read it and see if you guys have any reaction. But vehicle data is pretty robust, but crash reports often lack specific location data. Generally, only severe injury or fatal crashes have GPS location attached, while all other crash data is less accurate. Near mile, as an example, near mile marker 280 south of intersection road 1 and 33, etc. To make data more usable, we need to get report data as accurate as data from vehicle sensors, etc. Any reactions to that?
Well, I can definitely comment on that. Yeah, certain states have better reporting of location data for their crashes. I can speak for Iowa, about 99% of all crashes, that's from cities, counties, and DOT, have lat long, actually where the crash occurred, because they use a location system within tracks. It's a tool that is part of the crash reporting. So, and that varies across all of our states. And so this is a big challenge for states that don't have good location. A lot of times the parking lot where an officer might have filled out 10 or 12 crash reports are the locations. So it's a big problem in aligning performance operations data, as Paul talked about, from a company like Wejoe with these other data. And if you don't, you're starting to group stuff and by time of day and location and roadway name. But if the crash data are not accurate, you can't expect super accurate results without reading through context. And that's very time consuming.
Good answer. Thank you, Neil. All right. Well, we're about out of time. So I want to thank everybody again for speaking and presenting and for everybody's active engagement in this. And I thought this was super interesting. It's great to see how big data is coming and it's already here, and maybe we can even start using it on many a project. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.